And ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Experience Hockey Talk, serious hockey talk for serious hockey fans, with yet another exclusive Patreon episode here for all of you. And joining me now on the show is author and NHL analyst. I'm going to call you an analyst because I see you analyze all the time.
That's right.
My good friend, Ted Starkey. Ted, we were talking before this, and we went, no, we got to talk about this on the show. But real quick, how have you been, my friend?
I've been good. Hockey's starting up. A month into the season, you're starting to see some of the teams develop, and obviously it's been a very interesting season so far. A lot of surprises, a lot of disappointments. So it's going to be interesting how this plays out.
And you speak about that, and you and I, we both know that this season is a much different season for the Washington Capitals, knowing the losses that they had and the minimal gains that they're able to bring in. What are your thoughts on the Washington Capitals right now? They have 11 points in the standings. At one point when I actually did a interview on Sports on the Hill podcast Monday night, they're only like 1 point behind the next team, and they're 5 points behind the first place team, which is the New Jersey Devils, which is a weird thing to say right there. Obviously, a couple teams have played some games since then, and the Capitals play the New York Islanders tomorrow, which could change things a little bit in the standings again if the Caps win or lose. What are your thoughts on the Caps right now, looking at how they are?
I mean, I think you knew when they were coming into the season, their depth was going to be an issue. I thought, obviously with the salary cap problems, they knew they wouldn't have the luxury of having quite the deep team that they have in the last couple of years. But this year, obviously, the depth is an issue. And then once Niskanen went out, that really kind of put some pressure on what's already kind of a weak point with their defense. But the thing is, you got to look around the National Hockey League. I mean, it's a different season than last year. You don't have, last year Washington and Pittsburgh were pretty much the 1-2 punch around the league, and you pretty much knew that one of those two teams was going to win the cup. This year, you have a lot of teams that have glaring weaknesses. I mean, you look at the Pittsburgh Penguins. They're 0-4 and back-to-back, so they've gotten blown out in some of those games. You look at the New York Rangers. They traded some of their depth to get Kevin Shattenkirk, and they're having severe issues because, Hank Lundqvist isn't quite able to erase those mistakes that he might be in the past. And so it's more wide open league this year. So it's going to be very interesting. I mean, like you're talking about the Devils. I mean, the Devils are one of those teams. They've accumulated a lot of points, but are they going to be able to hang on? The Islanders have started off fairly well. Are they going to be able to hang on? So it's going to be one of those things that you're kind of see these teams develop. You'd have the initial first 10 games of the season. Now you're starting to see, some weaknesses. Some other teams will start to bubble up. And some teams that have been struggling will probably start to get it together, although, maybe for a team like Arizona, maybe too late already. But, for everybody else, they still have a shot to try to, kind of climb back in the playoff race. And like you were saying, the playoff chase is very close. I mean, if you look at the East, pretty much everybody is in the race. Maybe you take out Buffalo, maybe you take out Detroit. But, you can make a case for any of the other 13 teams that they can make the playoffs this year. And so it's going to be interesting.
Now, one thing I've been saying a lot, and I've said it in the preseason, I said it at the beginning of the season, I'm still saying it now. This is a season for the Capitals that I'm actually excited for because they aren't the favorites, and they have to face adversity. How much stronger do you think that can make this team? The fact that they're not the favorites and they have to face all this adversity. And we'll talk about the injuries more in depth because obviously it's just not the Capitals who are dealing with these big injuries. It's a lot of teams that are dealing with a lot of these big injuries as well.
Exactly. I mean, you think about it with the Caps. I mean, you could tell last year in Game 7, they just put a lot of pressure on themselves. And, the last 2 years, they've gone into the playoffs being the heavy favorites, and I don't think you're going to see that. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because I think at some point, you got to remember, the most successful run of the last couple of years was 2012 when they were heavy underdogs to the Bruins, and they managed to upset the Bruins in 7 games. You look at the rest of the series, they haven't really performed well in Game 7 at home. They've had their difficulty, and I think going to a playoff series with a team they're not necessarily a heavy favorite, I don't think it's bad for their psyche, because I think they're still, their core is very solid. I know over the offseason, Brian McClellan, was very careful to try to protect what he thought was the core. I mean, obviously they lost a number of players, but I think he was very careful with Oshie to make sure he had like the group of players that he thought that really needed to be kept together. But I think, they're still a very good team. I think a lot of people kind of overrated the losses. I mean, as I said, you look at the rest of the division, I don't think the Penguins are better than they were last year. I don't think the Rangers are better than they were last year. So I think everyone in the division got a little bit worse, and Washington's no different. But I think, they really put a lot of pressure on themselves in years past. And I think, like you said, I don't see it as a negative if, let's say, they finish second or third in the division, or even fourth spot, because, then you get the crossover to the other division, which, the Islanders and Rangers haven't found too unfavorable in years past.
Well, it's interesting they bring up be the fourth seed, get that first wild card spot you can cross over. Interesting note, right now the Tampa Bay Lightning are the first place team in the Eastern Conference, which means you would want the fifth seed or the second and final wild card spot,
right,
if you want to cross over. I mean, will that stay the same? Probably not. But with the way Tampa Bay's been playing, let's talk about that. Nikita Kucherov and Steven Stamkos, you get a healthy Steven Stamkos, and we've seen Nikita Kucherov really step up in Stamkos' absence last season. How dangerous are these two going to be, especially if Stamkos stays healthy the entirety of the season?
Well, I mean, that's the thing that's been for the Lightning the last 2 years. Stamkos has been hurt for a good majority of the season. If they can keep him healthy for the entire year, obviously they're a much, much different team than they were last year, the year before, because obviously he adds another dimension. Problem is, if Tampa Bay hypothetically use Stamkos again, then you can kind of key on Kucherov, and it's a little bit easier to defend. The problem is when you have two snipers playing together on the power play or on the line, it's much more difficult because you can't really shade one or the other, because then you're leaving the other one wide open. But Tampa Bay's obviously got a nice on core. It'll be interesting to see. Obviously, I don't think the Atlantic is quite as difficult a division as the Metro is, so they have a little bit of an advantage. I mean, you have Toronto, who's, they're showing their ups and downs. They started off really well, and they've kind of cooled off recently. Montreal is kind of a mess right now. Boston and Ottawa are kind of fighting for positioning. Ottawa's kind of overachieving at the moment. They'll probably fall back a bit, but they're still a pretty good team. So, but overall, they're probably the class of the Atlantic Division.
Well, you mentioned Montreal, and obviously some of their big offseason acquisitions the last few seasons have been like Shea Weber, Carl Alsner,
right,
and then obviously the trade for Jonathan Drouin, which they gave up a really good defensive prospect to, ironically, the Tampa Bay Lightning. For the Montreal Canadiens, they didn't re-sign Alexander Radulov, which I thought was a mistake for them. But they did get Jonathan Drouin, but by picking up Drouin and losing Radulov at the same time, they really didn't help their offense. And Carey Price signed that 8-year extension over the summer too. What does Montreal need to do besides potentially fire their general manager and get a new set of eyes in there, which probably should have happened years ago, to really fix this team? Because they have no offense. They have a great goalie who can carry them, but without offense, there's nothing much more Carey Price can do for this team.
Exactly. And, the problem is, too, is, you're speaking of Alsner and Weber, you're building a defense for the pre-lockout type of team. They're good defensively, but they're not quite as mobile. And Alsner's been, quite honestly, been eaten alive on the top pair up there. And you see, the Canadians are they're kind of hemorrhaging talent. And, they're kind of in the same position as the Rangers. The Rangers, as I alluded to earlier, they kind of thinned themselves out in the offseason. Montreal did as well. I mean, I thought Montreal made some very questionable moves. Jonathan Drouin is a nice player, but I'm not sure. I think the expectations that the fans there have of him are probably higher than he actually can achieve. I think he's more of a kind of a depth guy rather than a guy you're going to build your team around. And I think, I think they're not really building for this model of today's NHL. They're building for kind of a past edition. Maybe 10 years ago this team would have been pretty good, but with the speed and finesse of the game, Carl Alzer, to be honest, has not been right since last year. He had that injury, and he still doesn't have the speed, and he was never particularly speedy to begin with, and he doesn't have the speed he used to have, and so it's kind of a big vulnerability. I think that's part of the problem. Like you were saying, Carey Price is kind of left out to dry because the defense isn't very good. They're not scoring a lot of goals, and obviously something's probably going to have to change there because if they continue this much longer, they're not going to make the playoffs, and fans there are not going to be very happy.
Yeah, and not only that, but we are definitely seeing the fruits of the labors for the Nashville Predators in that PK Subban Shea Weber trade. I mean, Shea Weber, great shot, great for the power play, has always been solid defensively, but PK Subban just adds that other element. And Nashville, he's a reason Nashville went to the Stanley Cup Finals last season.
Yep, I mean, and then you were talking about pre-lockout and post-lockout. Subban is a perfect post-lockout type defenseman. He moves the puck. He's mobile. He's skilled with the puck. I mean, as I said, Alzner is a great stay-at-home defenseman in his prime, but he's been hurt and he's not exactly what he used to be. Shea Weber has a terrific shot, but he's not as mobile. He's not what you really need. And if you have a player like Carl Alzner now or Shea Weber, you really have to pair them with that skilled defenseman. To you want the anchor to a offensive forward, as it used to be like when you had the Capitals had Mike Green. You'd always want to make sure Green was with a defenseman who would be responsible. So, Green could take off, rush the puck, but say someone like Carl Alzner would stay back. But instead, Montreal has the anchors without actually having anyone who can really, carry the puck up and drive the offense.
Yeah, and you look at that, and I mentioned also that, there's a lot of injuries. It's not just the Capitals who lost Matt Niskanen, Andre Burakovsky, Brett Connolly, Tyler Grayovac. Those are the four guys that they have lost to injury. Let's talk about Vegas. Vegas has lost Marc-Andre Fleury, Malcolm Subban, and Oscar Dansk. And then Boston, I just saw an NHL, on the NHL Network, I forget what show it was, it might have been NHL Live, but they have like 6 guys out. 5 now that Tuukka Rask is back. And they just announced that David Backes is going to be out like at least 8 weeks because he just had surgery to remove some of his colon.
Yes. No, it was interesting. I saw the Knights on Monday, and, you think about it, they've dressed, because they let Calvin Pickard go right as the for the roster finalization. They've had 6 goalies in the matter of a month. It's crazy. They obviously Fleury was lights out, and then he got hurt with a concussion. They're hoping he gets back sooner than later, but who knows? They picked up Malcolm Subban over waivers right before the roster freeze. He got hurt, and then this past week, they lost another goalie. So it's been crazy. I mean, and obviously Vegas has been one of the surprises in the league. I think it was interesting to watch them. They like to control the puck. It's almost like watching a youth team. In kids teams, they have an exercise where you try to pass it to every player before you shoot the puck. That's almost what they're like. They're very close to the puck. They make short, high percentage passes, and they try to control the play that way, and they do a pretty good job. But the last 2 games, their goaltending really. Basically, they have their goaltender who's a backup for the Chicago Wolves, and he basically, he showed why he was a backup goalie in the AHL because both the Islanders and Rangers really, didn't treat. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty obvious he wasn't going to be able to carry them. I mean, they've obviously gotten very lucky that Subban and Fleury were good, but at some point too, they're really playing above their heads, and it's a long season, so it's you're eventually things catch up with you.
Well, it's definitely apparent that the 1, 2, 3 for the Vegas Golden Knights in that is Marc-Andre Fleury, followed by Malcolm Subban, who was playing spectacular before he got injured, and then Oscar Dansk, who also was playing very well until he got injured.
Exactly.
So having your top 3 out, they're saying Fleury is day-to-day right now. Do you potentially make a move to try to help the hemorrhaging in your net, or do you just stay with it? You take your lickings and you wait for to get Fleury back, or if Subban's back before him, get him back in there.
Well, I think it was interesting because Gallant made a point that you got to remember they're still an expansion team, and I think they expect to take some lumps. So my guess is they're going to just stay the course. I mean, obviously, I can't see them giving up a major asset to get a goalie, which I'm sure they're hoping that Fleury will be okay. Maybe if Fleury's injury was a little bit more serious, you'd have to consider it. But my guess is what they're going to do is they're just going to kind of let it ride. Maybe if the next team to try to put a goalie through waivers may have a problem, but I don't see them doing a whole lot just because I think they're kind of in a long-term mode of building and not really worrying about it. I mean, as I said, they've done well, but I think they kind of know playoffs are still out of reach. I mean, you're not going to be able to keep up 82 games with this roster to make the playoffs in the West, which is probably going to be 95 points, and they'll probably still be in the 70s to 60s range when it's all said and done. But so I would think they're gonna let it ride. I mean, is it maybe they get a waiver claim, maybe they make a minor deal, but unless one of these goalies is out for a long period of time, and I know Dansk, they didn't think it was overly serious. I mean, they thought it was going to obviously be some time, but not, he's not gone for months. And maybe if that was the case, they'd make a move, but I think they're going to just wait till Fleury gets healthy.
All right. Now, we're talking about the West, some other surprises out West, because we really don't talk about the Western Conference out here, but we follow a lot of hockey, though. Some other surprises besides Vegas and how great they've been to start the season has been Los Angeles and Colorado.
Yes.
And Colorado is the most interesting one, especially with the whole Nathan McKinnon Matt Duchene. My bad.
Yeah,
Wrong player.
Yeah,
the Matt Duchene ordeal of when's he going to get traded?
I mean, that's the interesting thing because he's kept a high price on acquiring him. I mean, obviously he's been linked to a lot of trade rumors, and it seems like Joe Sakic he's I think some of the other general managers have thought maybe they'll let him go cheaply, and I don't think Sakic is willing to let him go cheaply. So, at some point when you have a player like that, there's either two ways they can go. They can go into a funk and they can struggle, or they could say, look, I'm going to play well so I can increase my trade value. And I think that's what's happening in Colorado. And obviously, the big thing with the Avalanche, too, you have to remember Semyon Varlamov was hurt for most of last year. And they didn't really have stable goaltending behind him. I mean, look at, Pickard was one of their players, and he ended up getting taken in the expansion draft, and Vegas let him go, essentially. So, Varlamov has been healthy and been playing well, and they've been playing well. You talk about Los Angeles, Jonathan Quick has been playing well. He was gone for a chunk of last year, too. And you lose your number one goalie in the league, and it really can impact you. You're talking about Vegas. I mean, I can't name an NHL team that would do well going down to their fourth goalie. If the Capitals lost Holtby, Grubauer, and Copley, they would not be in great shape. I mean,
well, we have Vitek Vanacek, so that's number 4, and then Ilya Samsonov. We can't touch him because he's in the KHL right now.
Exactly. I mean, in that case, if you're the Capitals with Brian McClellan, then I would say, yeah, they'll probably make a move because they know, losing a couple of games because you're playing a AHL backup as your starter, that's one thing. But I think Vegas's expectations are low. But as I said, the goaltending. The interesting thing that's happened this year too is so many teams were so concerned about losing a goaltender to Las Vegas that they really had thinned themselves out. I mean, you look at Pittsburgh with Niemi. I mean, Niemi didn't last a month. The Rangers, Pavlik. Yeah, I mean, Pavlik in New York hasn't done that well, and there's very few 1-2 tandems. I mean, I know over the summer, a lot of people were upset about they wanted to keep Nate Schmidt over Philip Grubauer, but the Capitals, if they would have had Holtby and Copley, how would Copley do as a backup? Grubauer's played a couple games. He hasn't got a win, but he's played pretty well. And those games could be gotten really ugly out of hand. I mean, unfortunately for Grubauer, he's been the kind of
The scapegoat a little bit.
the hard luck guy because he's playing at the back ends and back to backs where the Caps did not look very good. But I mean, the Capitals, if any of the starters in the East get hurt, the Capitals are not in terrible shape because I think Grubauer is a more than capable backup. But a lot of these other teams in the Pittsburgh, if they lost Murray for a while, or the Rangers lost Lundqvist, or the Canadiens lose Price, that's a big drop off. And for a team with its window this year, I think it's kind of underrated that you have two good goalies because I think it's a luxury that a lot of teams don't have anymore.
Right. And going back to Los Angeles real quick, obviously with Colorado, the big thing is Matt Duchene. Is he going to get traded? If he does, what comes in return? And I think the fact that he's bringing a positive attitude to the locker room, that's helping the team. But for Los Angeles, with John Stevens, Daryl Sutter is out as coach, John Stevens is in as coach. Guys like Dustin Brown and Anze Kopitar, their games have been opened up a lot more now in Los Angeles as well. Like, people have been criticizing the contract that Dustin Brown has signed and essentially became a fourth liner. He's like a first line guy again. He's producing first line numbers for the type of contract that he has. And I think that's a big factor of why Los Angeles is also doing so well.
Exactly. And sometimes it's funny with the NHL. They're talking in New York about Alain Vigneault, if he's going to stay. But at some point, once he gets about the 3-4 year mark as a coach, even if you're a very good coach, you sometimes lose the team. And I think sometimes you just need to make a change. I don't know what it is. You've had some very good coaches in this league. But once you get to that 3 or 4 year mark, the team doesn't respond anymore. And sometimes when you bring in a new voice, a new system, that they can come in and play well. As I said, with Quick playing well, and they're certainly playing with a lot more energy than the Kings. The Kings used to look kind of old and tired in the last couple of years. And I've seen them a couple times this year, and they don't look that way anymore. They're playing with a little bit more speed. I think they're kind of trying to open up their game a little bit more than they had in previous years. They were so reliant on Quick before, especially during the Stanley Cup runs. But I think they've still got a lot of talent on that team, and they're playing real well.
Now, you mentioned like a coach after he's been there for 3 to 4 years, he kind of loses the locker room a little bit, and then you get a new voice in. Do you think that could potentially be a situation in Chicago under Joel Quenneville? And the reason I ask this is because of, well, one, how they got eliminated from the playoffs last season, where they got swept in 4 games by Nashville and only scored 3 goals, which, by the way, is how many goals Tom Wilson had in the playoffs himself. And I still have very high hopes for Tom Wilson with the Caps, just for the record. But you and I can talk about that later. Do you think Joe Quenneville could potentially be in that same scenario?
I mean, as I said, it's very strange because, even if you're a really good coach, that, sooner or later your team doesn't respond to you anymore. And, obviously Chicago's got high expectations still. Their core is aging, but they still have a pretty decent team. And, if they have another quick exit at the playoffs, you got to wonder if he's going to be safe. And, obviously a guy like Quenneville hits the open market, he's going to be fine because someone will snap him up very quickly.
Yeah,
but
and put in perspective that say he gets let go this offseason, due to a quick exit again, and Barry Trotz doesn't re-sign with the Capitals.
Yeah, I mean that's as I said, you just don't know because it's kind of like. When you teams with high expectations is a little bit different. And obviously, Quenneville's, whether they win or not, he's still a very, very good coach. It's just sometimes, I don't know if it's a familiarity where, the players don't listen to him as much anymore. Obviously, he's won the 3 Stanley Cups, but, it's the NHL, everyone gets fired. There's very few coaches that go through and are able to retire without getting fired. And I don't think, Quenneville's a great coach, but there's pretty much no exceptions to that rule.
Right. So let's do a little transition here. I mentioned at the very beginning when I introduced you, and then we just kind of got right into it because that's what we do, that you're an author.
Yes.
One of your books is Red Rising about the Washington Capitals, and your most recent book is Chasing the Dream. Why don't you tell everybody what both of those books are about?
Well, obviously, Red Rising was the story. It's now what we're talking about is about 5 years old now, but it's about the change with the Capitals post lockout. Kind of it goes from the 2002 playoffs, and then basically when they kind of tank out, decide to go for Alex Ovechkin in the NHL draft, or whoever was going to be a high draft pick, and then goes to 2012. Obviously, we had the changes with Bruce Boudreau. It's basically Dale Hunter, and then starts, basically ends at the beginning of the Adam Oates era, which we know how that turned out. Chasing the Dream is about the American Hockey League. Basically, it's a profile of 7 teams, including the Capitals affiliate, the Hershey Bears, and basically kind of talks to a bunch of the guys who play a bulk of their careers in the American Hockey League. They're kind of guys who want to play hockey. They're not making the big bucks of the pros. They're not flying charters. They're not staying at the 5-star hotels. They're riding the buses and playing 3 games in 3 nights. It's funny. We talk about how difficult 2 games and 2 nights is for NHL teams. These guys play 3 nights and 3 games and 3 nights, and that third one's usually an afternoon game. So that's a pretty rough haul. But it was good. It's a different look. Red Rising talks obviously about a lot of the changes with the Caps, not only on the ice, but kind of how the culture changed. If you follow this team for a long time, it would be very strange to see this modern version of the Capitals, just because you didn't have the sellouts, you didn't have the marketing, you didn't have the Capitals were never considered on the same breath of being the number 2 team in town or the number 3 team in town. They were always kind of a distant behind everybody else, and how much the team has changed in the last generation. And the American Hockey League, obviously, I had some with the Hershey Bears. It was fun. I got to talk to some ex-Capitals. Steve Oleski was one of the good guys in the book. I talked to John Walton about his career, because he actually started out in Cincinnati of the American Hockey League, worked his way to Hershey, and then worked his way to Washington. It's funny. I'm actually working on a book a piece for the Sporting News this week on one of the broadcasters for the Las Vegas Golden Knights is actually the former Syracuse Crunch broadcaster. So that's what I was working on now. So it's interesting to see. The league. The one thing about the American League is it changes so quickly. The book was written about a year and a half before it was published, and almost every player that was in with a certain team had left. And you don't realize how fast these teams change compared to the National Hockey League. National Hockey League, you look at the Capitals, Ovechkin's been around since 2005, Backstrom since 2006. There are guys on certain teams in the AHL that haven't been around since 2015. So it's kind of a crazy look at, the world of minor league hockey as well.
Yeah, it is interesting. And how did you get inspired to do Chasing the Dream? This is a question I've always wanted to ask you in regards to that book, because obviously Red Rising, it's right there. It's the Capitals. Let's talk about how they've evolved over the years.
Right.
But for Chasing the Dream, you're talking about the American Hockey League, and as you said, constantly changing. Was that what inspired you to do it?
It was interesting because I had spent some time in Syracuse, and I had covered the Crunch for a couple years, and it was interesting. What sparked it is I actually saw an article in the Washington Post by Barry Svrluga about the Washington Nationals farm team was in Syracuse at the time, and they did a story of what it was like to be a minor leaguer in baseball. And I said, well, that'd be interesting to do for hockey, because a lot of people with the impressions of minor league hockey is kind of slapshot. And if you look at the minor leagues now, it's anything but, because with the importance of the salary cap now, teams really have to be careful with their development, and they have to have players who are ready to step in. I'll give you an example, obviously with Washington. I mean, you look at it now, they have to call up guys to fill in. And, guys they sign guys like Peluso, who could play in the AHL, but also can play in the NHL. And you have these guys who are basically, you can't have goons in the AHL like you used to be able to. The AHL used to be, 10 to 12 guys who were lifers. They basically hung around, played American Hockey League. They always stayed with the same team. They got a couple call-ups, but primarily were there for the AHL team. Now you can't carry those guys anymore. I mean, You look at the veteran rules in the AHL, you can only have a handful of veterans anymore. It's basically, you were talking about age earlier, Michael. Basically, once you're 26, you either are one of the chosen few who could stay in the AHL, or you have to go to Europe to keep playing professionally if you don't make the NHL. And so it's a lot different than it used to be.
So what you're saying is I'm playing in Europe right now because I'm 31.
Yeah, yes, you're playing for Jokerit.
Okay.
They're a fine KHL team outside, so you don't have quite the travel issues that some of the KHL teams have.
All right, sounds good. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. But you're like what, a couple months younger than Yager or something like that. So you
1 month,
so. 1 month younger than Yager. Okay, so you're with me on that team then. So.
Yeah, that's right. I'm playing in the Czech league.
Oh, okay.
So I'm biding my time in the second division.
Oh, okay. I see how it is. You don't want to be my teammate. All right, fair enough. But you brought up a good point, and that's development, and
right.
The development of players, and it's once again a great segue. I mentioned that I still have high hopes for Tom Wilson,
right?
Because he's like 23 years old.
Right.
When he was in juniors, he was a goal scorer.
Right.
Like, the kid can score, and we saw in the playoffs what he can do when he has that confidence in him and he gets the puck on his stick, he scores. I mean, he had the same number of goals as the Chicago Blackhawks did as an entire team in the playoff series.
Right.
And when you look at Tom Wilson's development as a player, you mentioned Red Rising ends right when the Adam Oates era began.
Yes.
That was the problem right there.
Well,
because Tom Wilson should have stayed in juniors one more year and then gone to the AHL. His rookie season should have been the first year of Barry Trotz, in my opinion.
I mean, that's the thing. The one drawback. I mean, the interesting thing is, I know there's talk now about changing the age of the draft to 19, because Wilson was really between a rock and a hard place, because he probably was too good for junior, but he really wasn't ready for the National Hockey League. He would have been better served, hypothetically, had he been able to go to Hershey, but because obviously, if you're a Canadian juniors, you can't go to the AHL until you're 20. You either have to go back to your junior team or you stay with the NHL. And, the problem is Adam Oates kept him on the fourth line. And it's interesting with Tom Wilson. Tom Wilson, I'm old enough, almost Jagger-esque, to remember when Scott Stevens was young. And he reminds me in terms of his physicality of a young Scott Stevens, because first couple of years Stevens was with the Capitals, he really could not stay in the penalty box. He would take a lot of bad penalties, very undisciplined. And then once he got a little bit older, he still had that edge, because opponents knew he could basically check you the next week, but he wouldn't always use it. And I think the problem with Wilson is getting to the point of he's kind of got to adapt his game, especially now. Obviously, he's had 2 suspensions this season already. That if he does anything that's across the line, he's going to get basically sad for a while, because now that you're a repeat offender, that's basically even what would be a relatively minor transgression of maybe a game or two, you're going to get a couple games. So he really has to kind of adapt his game and be careful. But he's still, like you were saying, his talent level is pretty underrated. I do think he's developed in a pretty good penalty killer. In addition to is able to score in the playoffs. And he can be a valuable player. The problem is he just got to really control that physical element of his game, not to take bad penalties and not to get suspended, because obviously it doesn't do anyone any good for him to keep getting minor penalties.
Right. And one thing that many can say is that Barry Trotz these last 3, now in a 4th year, has been really trying to get that Adam Oates programming out of Tom Wilson.
Yes. Yeah, I think Trotz is a little bit more cognizant of his talent level. I'm not sure Oates really thought a lot of his talent level, or he just thought he was kind of more of a tough guy, because obviously he gained that reputation very quickly under Adam Oates, and he still hasn't shaken that.
Yeah, and I've been saying it for a while. Like, Tom Wilson needs to get top 6 minutes. If you can instill the confidence in him, which we saw in the playoffs. Put him on the top 6. Put him with Ovechkin and Kuznetsov. Put him with Backstrom and Oshie. Put him on the power play. Have him
Yep.
be a big body in front of the net. Instill that confidence in him. He'll start scoring goals and taking less penalties. He'll still have that edge, but he'll be scoring goals.
Yep.
And I think that's the way to do it.
Yep. No, I think I do think it's funny because you do see a lot of people kind of dismiss his talent, and I do think he has he's a very underrated player. He just has to be a little bit smarter about what he does. But he definitely, I remember when they first drafted him, obviously they thought, the player he was patterned after was Milan Lucic. And, he's kind of that player that plays with an edge with some talent, and he certainly can fit in that mold. But as I said, the big thing is he's just got to be a little bit smarter and, be a little bit more disciplined with, and the problem is too, is he's a big kid and, he'll go into players and, because he's a couple inches taller than some of these guys, that he's right at that elbow level and, shoulder level, and you just got to be careful. It's nothing you can do about it, but everyone's watching him. And, once you get a reputation with the referees and with the league, it's very, very difficult to shake.
Yeah. But one good thing is about Tom Wilson, besides the fact that he has a lot of upside to his game, is that he's actually really good at drawing penalties.
Mm-hmm.
Under Trotz, he has drawn a lot of penalties, and also under Trotz, his penalty minutes have gone down at the same time. So, Trotz is doing his magic. It's just taking some time.
Yep. I think, all the capital, it's interesting, as I said, because I know in the offseason there was a lot of angst over the Caps, and I think, they've still got a nice team. They're not going to be the dominant team they were, but that's because they don't have the depth anymore. But at the same time, you look at some of the, like I was saying earlier, you look at some of the other teams in the East, I think a good majority of the teams that you consider in contention took steps backward in the offseason. I think a lot of the improvement in the conference took place in the bottom half of the conference. Teams like New Jersey and Carolina. And I don't necessarily think that, any of the other teams that the Caps would be battling with in the playoffs this coming season would be any markedly better than they were last year. And, the Capitals aren't, but neither are the Penguins or the Rangers or the Blue Jackets.
Yeah, and I've always said this about the Hurricanes. The Hurricanes are a very competitive team.
Yes.
But when they made their moves, bringing in like Scott Darling, Justin Williams, Trevor Van Riemsdyk, that took them from a very competitive team to a very competitive team that could potentially knock you out of the playoffs.
Yes, I like, I like what the coaching down there has done. Bill Peters has done a really good job. They work really hard. I think the Hurricanes' biggest flaw in the past couple of years has been they don't seem to have quite the talent level. They've got a nice team that works hard. They will play 60 minutes. They will make sure if you take a night off, they will make you pay for it. But, they don't have quite the depth and talent that some of the other teams are fighting for playoff spots with. You look at a team like the Flyers, who are kind of in that bubble mix. They are a team of offensive talent with very little on the back end. Look at a team like the Islanders, are very thin offensively and kind of, they're okay defensively and okay goaltending. Boston, as you said, has the injuries, but they're another team that's got good goaltending, but not necessarily deep and kind of reliant on, you're relying on Marchand and you hope he carries the offense. And so, Carolina's in that mix. The big question, as I said, if they can get a little bit more, I think they need a little bit more pop up front to make a serious threat, but I think they're certainly capable of knocking somebody out so they sneak in.
Now, you mentioned the Islanders. I know you see a lot of the Islanders based on where you live.
Yep.
Do you think the Islanders, I believe they did, do you think the Islanders lost in the long-term run in the Jordan Eberle-Ryan Strome trade?
Well, it's interesting because the big question with the Islanders in the offseason, I think a lot of people pointed to the Eberle as a positive. It was Strome never really seemed to fit with the Islanders, and it was a big plus for the Islanders to get Eberle. I think the biggest negative that people kind of overrate is, when you're trading Hamonic out, and they're better this year offensively, but they're not quite as good defensively. You have guys like Dennis Seidenberg. Ryan Pulak was a big draft pick of theirs a couple of years ago. He's hardly playing. And you're playing a guy like Dennis Seidenberg, who basically was he was kind of an extra for the Bruins. Had a nice World Cup last year, and so he got signed. But obviously tomorrow will be interesting because the Islanders seem to be a team that they're very efficient at beating the teams below them, but they are not very good against teams that are better than them. So it's going to be interesting with the game against Washington. Obviously Washington's missing a couple guys. If you want to kind of get a gauge of where this team is right now, you can kind of see tomorrow. If they play well against the Islanders, then you can pretty much consider them a good team. If the Islanders kind of play really well, then you kind of see, well, maybe the Caps aren't quite so good. I kind of think that, I think they're still a pretty good team. I think, obviously the big thing with the Islanders is they are, their success they've had earlier this year has kind of been that top line. They have one line, they have Tavares and they have Eberle. And, both those guys, Tavares has obviously gone bonkers in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, he had 2 hat tricks in 5 games and stuff, something like
that. Yeah. He's basically, he's gone up to 11 goals. He was at 2 about 2 weeks ago. He's an interesting player. I've always said about him, when he's at the top of his game, he's one of the best in the league. The problem is he's the best in the league about a third of his games. The middle third, he's noticeable but not really a factor. And he has a third of about, you can tell he's playing. Ovechkin's been kind of that way, but I don't think to that degree. I think, maybe a quarter of Ovechkin's games, you can it's hard to notice him, but generally he makes some sort of impact even if he doesn't score. But, Tavares gets on these great runs. And, kind of the key tomorrow for Washington is probably making sure, Tavares doesn't get on the board too often. Kind of trying to exploit the Islanders' D. And as I said, if you match up the Capitals forwards and the Islanders forwards, Capitals have an advantage. The big thing is right now, Tavares is playing out of his world. And, the Capitals kind of have to balance that. Goaltending-wise, obviously Halak he's a known quantity. He's kind of at the back end of his career. Greiss can be very good in spurts. He's not a goalie that's capable of playing a lot of games at once. But he can be very good. Their defense is, their defense is fairly pedestrian. If they play Pulock, he's nice on the power play because he has the shot. But, their really top defenseman is Nick Leddy, who's a puck mover. Boychuk is a little bit past his prime, and you have other guys like DeHaan, and, they're okay defensively. But it'll be an interesting test for Washington because I think, they've had some time to rest after the Western road trip. The Islanders have won 3 of their last 4, but one of those games was against Arizona, and one of the games we were mentioning before was against Vegas against a 4th-string goalie. And quite frankly, the Islanders didn't look very good until the 4th-string goalie came in. They were actually tied at that point, and then they really took the game over once he came in. So it'll be an interesting game for Washington. I think they have a chance to kind of make up some of these points. Where they play the Islanders and Boston, and then Arizona and Buffalo next week. So you really have some winnable games there that you want to at least make sure you get. I think I said when Niskanen got hurt, the key for the Capitals is just not to sink. You want to make sure you kind of tread water. You're not going to set the world on fire in the stretch, but you want to make sure you don't go too far below NHL 500. And so far they've done that. And, you think at the very least you want to win 2 of the next 4 to kind of make sure you stay within, a game of NHL 500.
Right, and actually, one of the great things for the Capitals is that they're going to be getting Niskanen and Burakovsky back around Christmas time.
Right.
So it'll be like the perfect time for them to come back because that's really when you start really making that push for the playoffs right there.
Exactly.
And one last question on the Islanders: how much do you hate Barclay Center?
It's an interesting place. It's been interesting the last couple of years because obviously they moved in there in 2015, and the talk was, oh, it's an ironclad lease for 25 years, and then once the ownership went to John Ledecky, former Capitals minority owner, the talk changed abruptly. I think Ledecky it's interesting to see. He's been a lot more public this last couple of weeks than we've seen since he's been taking over the club. My gut impression is they are really, really focused on getting a new rink that they own. They've renovated the Nassau Coliseum. They actually played a preseason game at the Coliseum this year. And it's going to be very interesting because the Islanders have about a year and a half left on this lease at Barclays. And from what we've all heard, Barclays wants no part of the Islanders, or at least paying $53 million a year for them to play there. And the Islanders want no part of Barclays. And even if they get the new arena in Belmont, there's going to be a gap of probably 2 to 3 years that they're going to have to figure out somewhere else to play. Hypothetically, they could play at Barclays past the fourth year of their deal. However, as I alluded to, they're getting paid $53 million a year under the current contract. They're going to get nowhere near that to play if they break out of the deal. And with their attendance, Barclays, put it this way, for Capitals fans, Barclays would be the equivalent of putting the Caps in probably Towson, because the mileage isn't that far, but to try to get to Towson on, say, a Friday night is about 2 hours. And it'd be the equivalent of Capitals fans trying to go to Towson every game for 41 games. And, they don't have their arena is situated in the middle of Brooklyn, which pretty much, for all intents and purposes, is Rangers territory. If you're not familiar with the geography up here, the Islanders basically at best probably split Nassau and Suffolk counties, which are the two counties on Long Island. Once you get in the city, it's almost entirely Rangers fans. And so they're basically playing in the middle of someone else's territory. And it's just, it's been an interesting experiment. I mean, it's not a building made for hockey. I think Barclays ownership thought that because it was a new arena that it would be okay, and they thought that the fan base would automatically decide to take 90 minutes to 2 hours to get to the games, and that hasn't been the case. But the ice is poor. The sightlines, basically, if you go to a game at Barclays, you cannot get tickets behind one blue line because majority of the seats are obstructed view. The upper deck is very steep. I've been in the upper deck for a game, and even if you have someone of average size in front of you, it's difficult to see. So it's just it's not a very good arena, and I think both sides I think both sides want out. The big question is going to be what the Islanders' interim plans are, because publicly they're saying they're not going to Nassau Coliseum. The problem is the likelihood is going to be, after this contract is up, Barclays will probably ask for rent if they play at Barclays, and they'll have to collect their own ticket money, which would be a big drop in revenue. Madison Square Garden is partnering with the Islanders on this project. If they play Madison Square Garden, it's a very strange and surreal situation where they're playing the rink of their biggest rival for a couple of years, and one where you're already fighting for your Madison Square Garden is already difficult to get an event scheduled because you have the Knicks, you have the Rangers, you have concerts. So they would be drawing the short straw, and the only other option is playing in Newark, which is almost like playing in Brooklyn. So it's going to be very interesting. The Islanders are very convinced that they're going to get Belmont. They have what's called the TFP, which basically is New York State is going to grant them a license to basically build there. But the problem is, it's just because you get approved for the license to build there doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go smoothly. And it's just there's a lot of pitfalls, and obviously we haven't even touched on the Tavares issue.
Yeah, because this Barclays deal, the new arena, and all that other stuff, that could really dictate what Tavares does.
Exactly, and the problem is, with Belmont, you talk about things basically there's a big element that they can't control, because one of the aspects now with Belmont is it's actually one of the sites that's recommended for an Amazon HQ too. So as long as Amazon doesn't decide where to put their second headquarters, the likelihood is they're not going to approve it until then. I mean, I would be very surprised if New York State doesn't approve it. The problem is we don't know what the timeline is going to be, and the Islanders don't know what the timeline is going to be. It could be a couple months down the road. Once you get to the end of February, the issue becomes, what do you do with Tavares? Right now the Islanders are in decent shape, but let's say hypothetically the Islanders get a couple injuries, start to fall out of the playoff race. What do you do? He's going to get, with the McDavid deals and the Eichel deal, he's going to get close to probably 8 years at 13 from the Islanders. And that's not going to be a question. He's getting near the max deal. The problem is I think he wants to know where he's going to play. And, the other thing too is even if they get Belmont built, it's going to be a couple of years. If it's 5 years down the road, that's halfway down his contract. I think management has put a priority on trying to get the arena built. And I think it's kind of this old, the chicken or the egg, where a team kind of angling to get an arena will be like, well, we'll be much better if we get this arena. And then you kind of it's kind of a sticky situation because, you really don't want to, if you're the Islanders and you lose Tavares, you are basically going into a rebuild, because the importance of Tavares to this team is probably, it'd be more than, say, the Capitals losing Ovechkin, because at least the Capitals, you could say, if you lose Ovechkin, you have Backstrom, you have goaltending, you have a couple big names you could kind of work around. Tavares, I mean, then you fall off to the second tier of, Eberle and Andrew Ladd and Anders Lee. I mean, they're not even in the same class. And, I think Tavares comes back, because I think he's very loyal to the team, and I think he wants to stay. But there's that kind of that jumping without a net issue that the Islanders are going to have is, if the team goes south, if Belmont doesn't get approved, then you're getting into the aspect of this unknown of, what they're going to do.
Right. Now, normally we'd be doing wrap-up, but you know what? Since we're having so much fun, let's do a little overtime, because we were talking about, before we hit the record button, about anniversaries. You mentioned your Red Rising is like 5 years old now. Congratulations. Yes. Happy book birthday.
Yes.
But also that this season is the 20th anniversary of the Washington Capitals going to the Stanley Cup Finals.
Yes.
Which also marks the 20th anniversary of this joke known as the NHL shutting down the league to go to the Olympics.
Right.
Which I'm very happy they're not going to this year. So I want to start off the Olympics and state that the U.S. and the Canadians released their uniforms.
Yes.
And wow, they're ugly.
Yes.
I think I love the tweet of, this is why the NHL decided not to go to the Olympics this year, because nobody wants to wear those things.
Well, it's funny. It's funny because the last couple of Olympics, it's, the IAHF has a contract with Nike, and you look at some of the uniforms of the recent Olympics, and I don't know what they're doing.
The World Cup of Hockey jerseys were better.
Yes.
And I have two of them.
I mean, it's, everyone complained those were plain, but, you compare them to like the last couple Olympic jerseys and you shake your head, I said, I think, it's not even that Nike is really doing to sell them, because you hardly see them anywhere. It's not like the other sports, but yeah, it's going to be, it'll be very interesting with the Olympics this year. I kind of anticipated this was going to happen with the Olympics. I think, 2014, it's interesting with the Olympic experiment, because you talk about, they went in Nagano kind of in preparation for Salt Lake, and then you went to Italy, because that was in preparation for Vancouver. And then in 2014 was Sochi, which was basically a concession to, the Russian contingent. And once you got to South Korea, you don't have that push anymore. I mean, obviously, I think the NHL is probably going to go back in 2022 because they see China as a big opportunity, and the odds are that 2026 is probably going to be a North American city. But yeah, it's it's going to be interesting. I'm old enough with my Yager-esque age to remember when you had the Olympic teams would barnstorm, and a couple times they would play the Capitals. I mean, I remember a couple of preseasons the Caps would play. But back in the old, before the CBA wouldn't let them do it anymore, but they would play the Cap Center and they would play some of these Olympic teams, and it was a lot different. They would barnstorm, and this year is kind of a weird mix. You have a bunch of guys from the KHL and the European leagues, and a couple of collegians are going to make it. So it's going to be interesting, and it won't have the punch, but a lot of these games are going to happen overnight, so I'm not sure how many people are going to miss it.
Yeah, me personally, I just hate the fact that this is the only league of the major four that actually shuts down their season for almost a month for the Olympics, whereas the NBA lets their players play during the off season. Major League Soccer, who actually is technically the fifth big league in the United States, Major League Soccer just keeps playing during the Olympics. They don't stop. They don't even stop during the FIFA World Cup. They just keep playing. NFL, well, they don't. It's not even a real sport. And then baseball, they took out of the Olympics. So,
well, baseball. It's interesting with you bring up baseball. They basically had the equivalent of what the NHL has this year. You're basically having the Olympic baseball the last couple of years was a couple of guys who are out of the majors and minor leaguers who have no hope of making the majors. And so basically that's kind of why the interest in the tournament died, because, no one paid attention to it. You had, occasionally you have a guy like Roger Clemens play for Team USA, but that's when he was long gone from the majors. And, it'll be interesting. It's not going to be a very, you'll have some ex-caps in the tournament. I think you're going to have, Chris Bourque is probably going to make Team USA. You may have Justin Peters, former Caps back up in Team Canada. Kind of gives you the idea of the level of play you're going to have.
I'm rooting for Ben Scrivens, honestly, for Team Canada. So that's just me, but.
Well, it's going to be interesting, too, because obviously you're alluding to shutting down. I mean, the KHL is shutting down, and that's the reason because Russia wants to try to win a gold. That's not motivated by trying to make the tournament better. That's motivated by trying to win a gold medal for the Russian. That's been an elusive goal for the Russians since the fall of the Iron Curtain and the unified team.
Yeah, but not only that, but it's like, one, you shut down the league, which is an opportune time to really take advantage because, the NFL is over. They've done their Super Bowl. So you don't have to worry about them anymore. You can start playing all your Sunday games. Your only real competition is the NBA. And NHL is a lot better than NBA, in my opinion, but I'm just being biased at the same time. So you don't have the heavier competition anymore. It's just one other sport that you're really competing with. And then you shut down for an entire month?
Yep. Well,
really? And then great example is, we were talking about John Tavares. Yeah. If John Tavares didn't blow out his knee in that Olympic year, I think it was 2010, the New York Islanders would have made the playoffs.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just going to bring that up.
Or was that Sochi? It was either Sochi. It was either Sochi or Vancouver, but
Sochi. I was going to bring that up. I think people underestimate how much that particular injury really kind of drove. I mean, there's a couple different factors that drove the NHL out of the Olympics this year. I think the primary one is when you put your players at risk. And, if you're a team and you lose your star player like the Islanders did, there's no compensation. I mean, it's obviously the luck of the draw, and some guys are going to get hurt. But, there was no recourse for the Islanders to collect, that money. Because basically they were, if I remember correctly, they were kind of on the bubble of the playoffs that year. And then they lost Tavares. And as I said earlier, this team without John Tavares is not very good. And they were not very good the rest of the way. And so
and they could have made the playoffs. They really could have. Yeah.
I mean, you think about it. They made the playoffs in 2013. They made the playoffs in 2015 and 16. And the reason they didn't in 2014 is primarily because Tavares blew out his knee. And I think there's always been a couple of teams who've been against it. Jeremy Jacobs of Boston has always been a big guy who was very vehement about not shutting down the league. And I think, basically...
Coming from the guy who, has done like 3 lockouts.
Yes. But, I mean, it's, and they don't... The one thing, too, is you got to remember is I always like to say the IOC is up there with FIFA and the NCAA in terms of most corrupt organizations. And I think, you look at the amazing thing about the Olympic movement, too, now is, it used to be cities would fall over themselves to host an Olympics. And now, they basically have to find cities who are willing to do it now because it's such a financial drain. And I think the NHL is like, well, this organization is making billions of dollars and we're not seeing a dime of it. Why are we risking our main assets to basically support? I mean, probably the only financial factor that you could throw in there is obviously the NBC connection, because obviously NBC pays a lot of money to broadcast the games to the States. But beyond that, there's really zero benefit. And I know the NHL had approached the IOC about cross-licensing, allowing Olympic, the NHL logo on the boards, doing some other marketing, and the IOC said no because they are quite honestly just arrogant and they don't think they need it.
Well, and it's funny that you bring that up too because when the announcement came out officially that the NHL wasn't going to do it, Nick Kosnica of NHL.com came out with a really, really good article, and I actually read the article on the show because he hit like every point on the head. And the number one thing is that it doesn't benefit the game.
Right.
No matter how much you want to say it benefits the game and how it helps grow the game, there has been zero evidence of it. Best example, the NHL, and you mentioned it, the licensing. The NHL is not allowed to use any of the footage of the Olympics to promote any player. Sidney Crosby golden goal, too bad, can't use it. TXHT, that shootout winner against Russia, too bad, can't use it. And that at the end of the day hurts the NHL.
Exactly.
And it hurts the growth of the game. The number one thing that's helping the growth of the game, in my opinion, when it comes to Olympic hockey, is the women's game.
Yep, I agree. And it's interesting too because I alluded to Nagano, and I remember, obviously those games, they took place at 12:30 in the morning Eastern time, and I think when they went to Nagano, they expected more of a bump, and I think it's interesting because there's some parallels to Olympic hockey and the World Cup. There's a heavy interest when the Americans are playing, but that doesn't necessarily translate into people saying, oh, I watched the U.S.-Canada gold medal game, I'm going to go watch the Minnesota Wild and Columbus Blue Jackets. It's more nationalism, it's more on a grand stage, but, there's interest in it. But, like you said, if the women's team is playing Canada in prime time, they probably do pretty similar in ratings in terms of, in the interest level. And obviously, it was interesting when you mentioned the jerseys, who's up front and center modeling the jerseys today, member of the women's team. So I think you're going to obviously see the NBC promote them heavily. They're honestly the biggest beneficiary of the NHL not going because the men's team is going to be, kind of an unknown bunch of players.
I'll be honest, I never watched the men's after Bondra retired. I just watched the women's hockey because, quite honestly, after Bondra and Kolzig stopped going to the Olympics for Germany and Slovakia, I really just watched the women's hockey because, honestly, the women's hockey was more exciting to watch than the men with the NHL players in there anyways, because the women have more to prove than the men do. It shows in their game because they play their hearts out.
Yes, and the interesting thing, too, is, obviously the one issue with the women's game is, obviously the U.S. and Canada have been so dominant in that tournament. It's going to be interesting to see how these other countries kind of match up because, obviously Russia's been trying to develop their program. Sweden and Finland have tried to develop their program. But, it's like the old days of women's college basketball. You get UConn and Tennessee. And, that's what you're getting now. It's going to be obviously the U.S. team and the Canadian team is probably going to be the teams in the gold medal game, but like you said, it's great theater and fascinating hockey.
Yeah, and then we talked about Nagano, and it's an interesting fact because I've written a documentary about the 97-98 Washington Capitals. You were an author
Yes.
in your own right. I'm just some schmuck who makes films. But it's interesting to talk about Nagano because when it came to Nagano, they actually didn't shut down the league for.
They did.
They did, but the way they did it was very different compared to how they did it after that. Because they actually did an all-star break. But the funny thing is that before they actually went on the break, players were already leaving teams to go play in the Olympics. But the funny thing is that by the time guys were getting to their teams were getting eliminated from the tournament.
Right.
Like, I think Ole Kolzig was on the plane when the team got eliminated from the tournament.
Yeah, no, if you want to step back, it's interesting. You talk about the 97-98 season. In terms of the Capitals aspect, it was a fascinating year because you got to remember, this was a team coming off. They had made the playoffs 15 straight years. And, the 96-97 season ended. They missed the playoffs by a couple points. Jim Carey had traded away at the end of the last year. They acquired Adam Oates at the trade deadline, and he actually sat out a game for a contract dispute.
No, correct. No, you're wrong about that one.
Oh no, he wanted a new deal. He wanted.
Okay, so here's the full skinny because I did the research on this. I have the evidence, and I can show it to you later when we share notes about a potential team up. What happened was that so the trade was Anson Carter.
It was Allison.
Yeah,
Carey.
Jason Allison, Anson Carter, and Jim Carey to Boston for Rick Tocchet, Adam Oates, and Bill Ranford. Part of the concession that David Poile made for Adam Oates is that Adam Oates would get to renegotiate his contract because at that time players were allowed to renegotiate their contract. Adam Oates got his contract renegotiated over the summer before training camp started. Peter Bondra wanted to renegotiate his contract too after Oates got his contract renegotiated. He then actually sat out after playing 2 preseason games, got suspended by the team, missed the first game of the regular season, and said no, because George McPhee, who had just been hired, said if you want to renegotiate your contract, you have to play. So when Bondra missed the first game of the season, he said, you know what, I'll play, and then let's renegotiate the contract, in which they did. Sergei Gonchar was actually a restricted free agent holdout that season as well, but he signed in time to be eligible to play for the Caps for the remainder of the season and the playoffs.
Oh yeah, but when they acquired Oates the year before, he basically was unhappy with Boston because that's part of the reason Boston traded him. Yeah. So my point was that the Capitals basically missed the playoffs by the equivalent of 1 win. Yeah. And so they were coming in, basically, there was not a lot, put it this way, there was not a lot of fuzzy feelings at the first time when Oates came in. That obviously changed. And obviously, too, remember that that was the season that David Poile got fired.
Yeah.
And basically
and Jim Schoenfeld. Schoenfeld.
Yep, and then George McPhee came in.
And Ron Wilson.
Yep, and they started off the year in Landover. They played their first. The Verizon Center or the MCI Center at the time was not completed at that point. Basically, they played till November 26th, so it's actually coming up later this month is the 20th anniversary of the last game in Landover,
which was not televised. And it was not televised, and they retired. I have the article saved.
No, I have it on tape. Believe me, it was televised.
Really?
It's on HDA. Yeah, no, it was on.
Really, because the funny thing is, the article that I have, because I have like every Washington Post article from that season saved digitally through thanks to the Montgomery County Public Library. Which, by the way, Rachel Alexander is Rachel Nichols.
Yep.
Just writing that note out there. It was noted in the article that the game was not televised. You could only hear it on the radio.
Well, yeah,
and they retired Ron Langway's number, and that was in an article from 1997.
Oh no, it was on HGS. Believe me, I have a copy.
Wow.
Yeah, no, Yeah, no, it was they televised.
You and I need to share some notes now because my notes now feel outdated, even though they're from the actual date of the game.
No, they because they at that point HTS televised. The only times they wouldn't televise the game at that point was it would be around the end of the Orioles season. And some of the games maybe in March, but no, that was a major deal for them. It was because it was the last game in the Cap Center. I believe the Wiz played their last game a couple days later, but yeah, it was a big deal. I mean, the most at that point of their history, the majority of the games that weren't televised were on the road simply because production costs. But even
production costs, what are those?
Yeah, but yeah, no, that was as I said, they televised most of the games. I think at that point it was probably regular to have about 70 games. And like I said before, I want to say I don't believe they wouldn't televise any of the home games because, quite frankly, because it was cheaper to produce a home game than a road game. If there was a conflict, they would. But yeah, because being in late November, there wouldn't be much conflicts with obviously the Orioles or the Wizards. So
we didn't have the Nationals yet.
Yeah, so
we weren't getting them for at least another 8 years.
Yeah, but no, so it was an interesting season, and they went through, like you alluded to, they went to the Olympic break, and they were pretty much an average team until the Olympic break. And when they came back, they played pretty well, and they got to the playoffs, and it kind of was like everything, the thing that's underrated about the Stanley Cup playoffs is you basically have teams that can knock you out. And at that time, obviously, Pittsburgh was a team that matched up very well against Washington. Philadelphia would have matched up well against Washington because they had gone to the finals the year before. And Washington just basically managed to avoid any
the
of the teams.
Seeds. Yeah.
Yeah. I mein, they played Boston in the first round. Boston gave them a very tough test.
They played Ottawa in 5.
Ottawa. Yeah, Ottawa's not a very good team. They had won their first playoff series ever, but they were still a couple years away from being a real contender. And then Buffalo obviously was basically all Dominic Hasek. He was near his prime. They took the Sabres to the finals the next year, but Kolzig nearly. I think Hasek was still a better player in that series, but Kolzig was nearly as good. And the Caps were just a better team up front. I mean, the Sabres. If you look. Guys like Matthew Barnaby and Michael Pekka compared to Peter Bondra. And, the thing is, too, is you remember the Capitals were without Steve Konowalchuk during that series.
Yep.
He was one of their better players. And
he was out the entire playoffs, if I remember.
Yeah, he got hurt. He got hurt right at the tail end of the year. And then, they played there. It was a great run. And then, obviously, Detroit, the first 2 games in Detroit were very close. The first game was a 1-goal game. Obviously, game 2, infamous for different reasons. Game 3,
grumble, crying in corner, grumble.
But I mean, you look at it 20 years later, though. You got to remember this: the Red Wings team was, it's probably one of the better teams assembled in the last half century.
Well, actually, one of the great things is if you watch the documentary Red Army, which is an amazing documentary. I probably could have just said like 5 words in 1 word to describe this documentary because it's really that good. When they get to the tail end of it and they talk about how Scotty Bowman brought in like Igor Larionov and Vlasov Fetisov and Sergei Fedorov and and like 2 other guys that were from the Soviet teams, and they essentially let them be like the Russian 5 and just embarrass teams. There's no way in hell you're going to beat them in the Stanley Cup Finals. They're too damn good.
Exactly. It's just it's one of those things. They obviously were it's obviously not dissimilar to what's going on now because they for years before they had a bad reputation in the playoffs because before then they'd only reached the conference final once, and they were swept out by Boston in 1990. So obviously you had years of disappointment in the Patrick division, and then you had once they had the realignment, a couple of years of losing to he lost to the Islanders in 93, Rangers in 94 were a machine. It just, the disappointment added up against Pittsburgh. So it was a lot different to see, what kind of run they had. And it was, it's very different. As I said, it was a very strange season because I said, people remember just the April through June, but, obviously it was a big transition of the team. You went from a suburban Maryland team to DC, and they changed in a lot of ways. And it was just kind of a fascinating year.
Yeah. So, Ted, what's your next book about?
So we gotta see. Hopefully, my next goal is to try to do a book on the team that was memorable for a completely different reason, the 1974-75 Washington Capitals. I'm hoping to try to work on that because they, you talk about memorable for the wrong reasons. It's funny, you compare them to Vegas. Vegas in their first month won as many games as the Capitals won their entire season. And, they won, the thing is, they won 2 of their last 5. They won 6 games through 74 games. So, they were it was kind of a fascinating look at, basically, you think about it, they came at a time where the NHL had expanded from 6 teams to 18 teams in the span of 7 years. And you also had the World Hockey Association was draining talent. So essentially, the Capitals were building in a 30-team league from scratch. And they just, they were, you look at the stats and it's, people want to say an unbreakable record. I don't think anyone's going to come close to getting 21 points in the season because, A, you have the loser point now, and 2, if you're paying $500 million for a team, they're not going to let you be that bad.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, it's fascinating because they were just, there was so many funny moments in that year just because the team was so horrendous.
I remember, if I remember right, when they won their first game, they actually lifted up a trash can as if it was the Stanley Cup.
Well, it was the first road game. They did not win their first road game till March.
Right, that's right. Yeah,
they
won their first road game and they lifted the trash can as if it was the Stanley Cup because they're so happy that they finally won one.
Yeah, no, I mean they were basically, they were going almost their entire. I think they lost. I think they had 2 road games left after that one, and they basically, it was just a bizarre season. They went through 3 coaches in 80 games, and it was a very, very strange time. And you think about it, people with the Capitals are. You look at the team now. If you complain about the Capitals being bad, remember the first 8 years of this team, they didn't make the playoffs. I mean, they really only made a run once.
And there were drives to keep the team in at the time Landover too. Like you had guys like Paul Holmgren from the Philadelphia Flyers, doing commercials saying, come support your team. Yep, even though I played for the other team.
Yep, no, it was they were basically. They were a sad sack franchise. They played in the middle of Landover, and it was, they were not, it was an era of they did not have a whole lot of talent, and then they had a couple good players, guys like Dennis Baruch and Ryan Walter and Rick Green were some of the mainstays before David Boyle took over, but it wasn't until they got that Rod Langway trade. They brought over Engblom and Laughlin and Langway and Jarvis, and that really gave the team the identity. They played a defensive game. They were actually, ironically, they played ahead of their time. They were a defensive team at the time where no one played defense, and they really kind of rode that. They got Scott Stevens, Bob Carpenter. Then they basically became a contender, but they were also a contender at a time where the Flyers were really good. The Islanders were obviously coming off their dynasty. The Patrick was no picnic. It was very equivalent to what the Metro is, even maybe worse. But yeah, it was an interesting time. I mean, the sport of hockey has changed a lot, and it's kind of been interesting to see. You look at this, as I said, you kind of look at it relatively to the last couple of years, it's been the salad days. It's a team that's a playoff contender and a cup contender. And, there have been times where this team has been very bad and, the future hasn't been quite so bright. Even you talk about next couple of years with Ovechkin, eventually will leave the franchise, but, they're still in pretty capable hands. They have some talent. They have ownership who's willing to go to the cap, which in years, with Abe Poland, they wouldn't necessarily get a player if they needed. It was the reason for a lot of their failures in the 80s and 90s was they would not go out and get a player. I mean, there's a couple of years they did. Obviously, the Dino Ciccarelli trade paid a lot of dividends in the playoffs, but a lot of years their big rivals in the Patrick would get someone else, and they would stand pat, and it wouldn't be quite enough. And they didn't quite have the goaltending that some of the other teams in the Patrick had. Obviously, Billy Smith was great in the playoffs. Ron Hextall was good in the playoffs. And guys like Pete Peters and, Malarchuk and some of these other guys just couldn't match them. And so it's been fascinating. It's an interesting team. It'll be interesting to see how they do this year. I think they'll still be okay.
I still say they're a wild card.
I think they'll be. The season began. I predicted. I think the Penguins are going to win the division. I think the Capitals finish second. Columbus, I think, has been a little bit better than I thought. Rangers have been worse. I think the Capitals will finish. I think they'll finish in that 2-3 spot. I think. I think Pittsburgh obviously is still a very good team. I'm not sold on the idea that they're going to three-peat, but I think they probably now have the most talent in the division. But they've also got a lot of miles. I think Columbus. Columbus, you play that style. They kind of showed it last year. They play a very difficult style to maintain over 82 games, and I think that may show again. I think the Islanders are going to have some issues. Like I said, they're so heavily dependent on Tavares being good. I think they're going to I think they'll end up in that bubble, and they may miss out. Rangers, I think that it's going to be interesting because I think you're going to have to make a move at some point because they're just such a thin team right now, and Lundqvist is not able to mask those errors that he's been able to in years past. We talked Carolina. I think they're a pretty good team. They work hard. I'd be curious to see if they add anybody at the deadline. And New Jersey obviously has been off to a great start, but I'm not sold on them as a playoff team yet. I think they're going to be very good. I think they can make a run for it, but I think you'll see the core four: Washington, Pittsburgh, Rangers, and Columbus will probably get in.
I don't think Rangers will go in. I actually had the Rangers not making the playoffs this season, even before the amount of suck that they have done so far this season.
Well, I think at some point they're going to end up getting. There'll be a major change at some point, and that's going to be the interesting thing how they do it. If they get a coaching change or a major player movement, because the big thing for them, Rick Nash is going to be a free agent after this year, and I think they're kind of. They may just cut bait with him and see if they can bring someone else in, use that cap space for some other reason.
Yeah. But, so just to let you know, my 97-98 documentary, will never get made. So let's share notes.
Yep.
I know you want to do your 74-75 caps. Maybe we can come to some agreement.
Yes, most of those games are not televised. I believe that year they only televised 20 of them. So,
so let's compare notes. We could talk. Because one way or the other, I want to see that 97-98 thing that I worked on for like a good 15 months to research and write and all this other stuff to see the light of day somehow.
Right.
But real quick, where can the people find you on the social medias?
Man, on the Twitters at Ted Starkey, TEDSTARKEY. If you want to buy the book. They're available at Barnes & Noble, both of them, or Amazon. And I'm usually pretty accessible, and you can also read me at the Sporting News and other exciting outlets.
All right. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, this has been a Patreon-exclusive episode of the Experience Hockey Talk, Serious Hockey Talk for serious hockey fans. And if you're listening to this, thank you for contributing to the show. It allows me to continue to produce episodes like this, plus all our live Saturday show, which we do at the WBGR studios every Saturday at 11 a.m., which this Saturday we'll be having George Fusikis from NovaCaps. He is returning to the show to talk about the Capitals and also talk about his other favorite team, the Vancouver Canucks, as well. And once again, Mr. Ted Starkey, thank you so much for coming on. It's been fun, especially the fact that we've done like an hour and a half. Well, technically you and I have done much longer than what this recording has been.
Very nice. Yeah, it was a pleasure to be on. Always good to talk, especially the old Caps hockey.
All right, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will see you on the ice. Looking for some pre-Thanksgiving fun? Then look no further than to DerpyCon. DerpyCon, which is taking place at the Hyatt Regency Morristown in Morristown, New Jersey from November 17th to 19th. Come see special guests like David Yost, Walter Jones, Todd Havercorn, and so many more. For more information and to purchase tickets, visit derpycon.com today. Attention hockey fans, the Experience Hockey Talk is on Patreon. Come join the exclusive TXHT community today for access to exclusive episodes, interviews, and so much more. You can join the TXHT Patreon community at patreon.com/TXHT_hockey.